I still remember the way the church doors groaned open that morning, cutting through the quiet hum of grief like a blade. I was seated in the front pew, clutching a crumpled tissue, my body hollowed out by the loss of my only child. My daughter was just 23, brilliant and compassionate, lying still in a casket covered with lilies. The sanctuary should have been sacred, a place to honor her short but remarkable life. Instead, in strode the man I had not seen in 15 years, my ex-husband, Robert. He moved down the aisle with the arrogance of someone arriving late to a meeting, not the funeral of the daughter he'd abandoned. The air shifted the moment he appeared. People whispered his name, surprised, curious, unsure. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, but not from grief this time, from fury. There he was, dressed in a sleek, tailored suit, nails manicured, hair silvered with age, but styled as if image mattered more than decency. He slid into the pew beside me as though he had a right to sit there, as though years of silence and absence meant nothing. I wanted to scream. Instead, I sat frozen, staring straight ahead as the pastor began the opening prayer. Then, as if my pain wasn't already unbearable, Robert leaned toward me, close enough for me to smell the expensive cologne he'd worn back when we were married, and he spoke words that I will never forget. He said he had a right to talk about our daughter's estate, her money, not her life, not her love, not the years he missed, the milestones he abandoned, but her $35 million inheritance. In that moment, I thought of all the nights I stayed awake nursing Emma through fever dreams, of all the dinners I skipped to pay for her school supplies, of every tear I wiped from her cheeks when she asked why her father never called legal standing. He called it. That was his shield, his excuse, his weapon. And all I could think was, what about moral standing? What about the years he chose money and pleasure over fatherhood? As I sat there, staring at the coffin that held everything that mattered to me, a memory cut through the haze of anger. Emma was just 8 years old, her front teeth missing, building a blanket fort in our living room. She'd asked me to join her for a tea party with her stuffed animals. Her father had walked in that night, his face already distant, already planning his escape. I had found the divorce papers tucked away in his briefcase, proof of the affair I hadn't wanted to believe. When I told Emma to play in her room so we could talk, she skipped away humming, still living in a world where families stayed whole. But in minutes, that world would collapse. He left us that weekend and never came back. And now, after 15 years, he was here, pretending he belonged in this moment of grief, pretending he had the right to claim what my daughter built without him. I knew then this was only the beginning, because if he thought 15 years of silence would make me weak, he was about to learn how wrong he was. After Robert left, life became a blur of survival. I was 35 years old, suddenly both mother and father to a little girl who didn't understand why her dad no longer came home. I remember staring at the bills stacked on the kitchen counter, wondering how I was going to keep the lights on, pay rent, and still make sure Emma had everything she needed. I picked up extra shifts at the hospital, often working 2 jobs back to back. There were nights when I came home after midnight, my feet aching, my body trembling from exhaustion, only to find Emma asleep at the kitchen table, crayons scattered around her latest drawing. She would leave notes for me, little stick figure pictures of us together, with hearts scribbled in red. Those tiny love letters gave me the strength to get up the next morning and do it all again. We didn't have much, but I tried to make sure Emma never felt poor. On birthdays, I baked cakes from scratch, even if it meant skipping lunch all week to afford the ingredients. On Christmas mornings, I wrapped secondhand toys from thrift shops, polishing and cleaning them until they looked new. I still remember one December when I pawned my wedding ring to buy her a computer, an old, clunky desktop that barely ran. To me, it was just a machine. But to Emma, it was a doorway to a world that would change everything. She was only 12 when she started tinkering with code. I would come home to find her hunched over that computer, green eyes glowing with determination, typing lines I couldn't make sense of. She told me she was teaching herself how to build programs. At first, I thought it was just a phase, like when she'd been obsessed with baking cookies or sketching cartoon characters. But then she started fixing problems for neighbors, helping one of them recover lost files from a broken laptop, building a simple website for a local church. Word spread, and soon Emma was being called a whiz kid in our community. I couldn't have been prouder. Every report card was spotless. Every teacher talked about her brilliance. But what made me the proudest wasn't her intellect, it was her heart. Emma had this way of noticing people in pain. She would save her allowance to buy groceries for the elderly neighbor who lived alone. She volunteered at the library, tutoring kids younger than her. Even when we had nothing, she found ways to give. Meanwhile, Robert's absence hung over us like a shadow. Emma rarely mentioned him, but I could see the hurt behind her silence. When she was 16 and won a state science award, she stood on that stage in front of hundreds of people, and I was the only parent in the audience cheering her on. Afterward, she hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. In that moment, I knew that every sacrifice had been worth it. By the time she turned 19, Emma was accepted into a prestigious tech accelerator. She called me from our tiny kitchen, practically glowing with excitement, telling me she had been offered $5,000 and 3 months to build her idea into a real company. I was terrified. She was dropping out of college, risking everything. I begged her to stay in school. But she looked at me with those serious eyes and said she wanted to change the world. And she did. Within a year, Emma launched MedSure, a revolutionary platform for securing medical data. Hospitals that had struggled with lost files and breached records suddenly had a solution. By 21, she was licensing her technology nationwide. By 22, she was signing international contracts worth millions. I watched the same girl who once built blanket forts in our living room become a powerhouse, shaking hands with investors and making headlines in Forbes. Success never changed her heart. She would call me late at night, overwhelmed, confessing that the pressure scared her. But she always ended those calls by saying she was doing it for us. For me. For the nights I skipped meals so she could eat. For the mornings I walked her to school half asleep from working overtime. For the tears she cried when Robert never came back. I thought we had left him in the past. I thought his absence would remain just a scar we carried quietly. But Emma, brilliant as she was, had other ideas. She once told me she knew, deep down, that her father would try to come back if she ever found success. She said people like him could smell opportunity from miles away. What I didn't realize then was that while she was building a company, she was also preparing for him. She was laying traps, gathering evidence, making sure that if he ever returned, he wouldn't stand a chance. I only understood the depth of that preparation after her death. What sickened me most that day wasn't just Robert's presence, it was his performance. He slipped into the role of grieving father so smoothly, as if he'd been practicing in front of a mirror. After the service, I watched him mingle with Emma's colleagues and investors. His face solemn, his words polished. He clasped their hands, nodded thoughtfully, and spoke of his brilliant daughter as though he had been there to witness any of it. It was surreal. He moved through the crowd with practiced charm, introducing himself as if the past 15 years had never happened. My hands clenched around the program until it crumpled. I wanted to shout that this man hadn't even called his daughter once, that he had no right to claim grief in the same breath as me. But instead, I held back, waiting, watching. What unsettled me more was the way his lawyer hovered nearby. A thin man with an expensive briefcase and a cautious expression. He trailed Robert like a shadow. At first, I assumed he was just there for the inheritance claim. But then I noticed something in his phrasing when he finally addressed me. He didn't say Robert had rights. He said Robert maintained he had rights. That single word lodged in my mind like a splinter. Maintained. Why not simply say he has parental rights? It was subtle, but it told me something was wrong. Something Robert hadn't been honest about. And the more I listened, the clearer it became that even his lawyer didn't trust him fully. Later that week, Robert and this lawyer came to my home. I answered the door with a calm I didn't feel. Robert gave me the same smile he'd once used to win over dinner guests, the one that had hidden years of secrets. His lawyer looked uneasy, as if he already regretted representing him. When we sat down in my living room, I let Robert talk. He droned on about fairness, about being Emma's father, about legal claims. I tuned most of it out, focusing instead on the lawyer's shifting eyes and tight jaw. He kept glancing at Robert whenever the subject of rights came up. His words careful, hedged, chosen with precision. And in that silence between them, I saw cracks forming. That night, after they left, I sat with Emma's papers spread across the kitchen table. She had been so weak in those last months, her body failing, but her mind still sharp. I used to think she was handling company affairs from her bed, laptop balanced on her knees. But now I realized she had been digging for truth, preparing for exactly this moment. A memory surfaced Emma, her skin pale from chemo, looking at me with those steady green eyes. She had asked once if I believed people could change. I told her sometimes they did, but often they didn't. She just nodded, as though confirming something she already knew. What I didn't realize then was that she had already discovered the full scope of Robert's betrayal. She had uncovered the documents I'd never seen. The filings I hadn't understood years ago when I tried to pursue child support. It turned out Robert hadn't just abandoned us emotionally. He had done something far more permanent. To avoid paying even a few $100s a month, he had gone to court and legally terminated his parental rights. He had signed away his claim to Emma, his own daughter. I sat there at my kitchen table, the weight of it pressing down on me. The irony was breathtaking. The man who strutted into her funeral, demanding millions, had once chosen to sever his legal ties to her altogether. He had erased himself from her life on paper, the same way he had erased himself in reality. The next morning, his lawyer called me privately. His voice was tight, professional, but underneath, I could hear unease. He said he needed to withdraw from Robert's case. There were ethical issues, he claimed, though he couldn't share details. I didn't need them. I already knew. Robert had lied to his own attorney, just as he had lied to everyone else. For the first time since Emma's death, I felt something other than grief or rage. I felt satisfaction. My daughter had been right. She had predicted her father's greed and had armed me with the truth. And as I sat there, piecing together her careful preparations, I realized I hadn't even uncovered the half of it yet. Emma's brilliance wasn't just in building a company. It was in building a defense so ironclad that Robert wouldn't even know what had hit him. What came next would reveal just how far she had gone to protect me. And her legacy, from the man who had walked away. As I sifted through Emma's files, I began to realize that my daughter hadn't simply built a company she had built a fortress. Every folder, every email, Every carefully labeled binder revealed how much thought she had put into protecting both me and her life's work. Emma knew her father. She had studied him like an open book, noting every selfish choice, every vanishing act. She once told me, half smiling, that people like him always showed their true colors when money was involved. And she had been right. She anticipated his return the way one might anticipate a storm inevitable, destructive, and best prepared for long in advance. There were legal documents Emma had worked on with her attorney, David Washington. She hadn't just written a will. She had created a detailed estate plan that accounted for every possible challenge. Robert's name wasn't anywhere in it, not because she had forgotten him, but because she had already accounted for his absence. She had included evidence that he'd voluntarily severed his parental rights, along with certified copies of the court documents. She had even annotated them with her own notes, almost as though she were leaving breadcrumbs for me. But Emma had gone further. In another folder, she had compiled information about her father's life after he left us. There were photographs, addresses, bank records, and testimonies from women he had charmed and discarded. Each one told a familiar story, a woman with some money or assets, a relationship that started with promises, and an ending marked by financial loss and abandonment. He hadn't just left us, he had left others too. It was a pattern, a trail of damage stretching across more than a decade. My heart broke when I saw the letters Emma had exchanged with one of these women, a mother named Carol, whose daughter, Sarah, had been only 4 when Robert moved in with them. 3 years later, he disappeared, draining their savings before walking away. Emma had quietly reached out to Carol when she was still healthy, offering help to Sarah with school and counseling. My daughter, even as she built her empire, had been secretly supporting another abandoned child, the mirror image of herself. I sat there in awe of her. She hadn't just thought about revenge. She had thought about protection. She wanted to make sure that other children didn't suffer the same confusion and hurt she had endured. Emma had created a foundation tucked into her estate, designed to fund scholarships and counseling for kids abandoned by parents. It was her way of turning pain into power, absence into love. And then, just when I thought I had seen everything, I uncovered the most damning file of all. This one wasn't about abandonment or heartbreak, it was about crime. Emma's investigator had dug deeper than I could have imagined. There were credit applications under false names, bank accounts tied to fraudulent Social Security numbers, and tax filings riddled with lies. Robert hadn't just been a selfish man, he had been a criminal. For years, he had been weaving a web of fraud to cover debts and dodge. Responsibility? The documents were meticulous. Dates, account numbers, even photographs of Robert meeting with shady associates. Emma's notes were sharp and precise. If he tries to challenge me, this becomes public record. She wasn't bluffing. She had crafted a plan where every move he made against her estate would trigger his own downfall. The shock of it settled into me slowly. My daughter, weak and frail in her final months, had spent her limited strength protecting me, protecting her legacy, and exposing the man who had once abandoned us. She could have rested. She could have let go. But instead, she fought one last battle, ensuring that her father could never again harm us or anyone else. For the first time since her passing, I felt something close to peace. Not because I had justice yet, but because I realized Emma had left me more than memories. She had left me a roadmap, a shield, and a sword. Robert had walked into her funeral expecting an easy claim to millions. What he didn't know was that he was walking straight into Emma's trap, a trap designed to reveal him, not as a grieving father, but as a fraud, a predator, and ultimately, a criminal. And as I sat with those files spread across my dining table, I knew the storm he had brought with him was about to break over his own head. Robert's downfall came faster than I expected. Once Emma's files were placed in the hands of the right people, the mask he'd worn for so long slipped away. His attempt to claim her estate unraveled in days when the court records showed he had terminated his parental rights years ago. The lawyer he hired walked away from him, unwilling to touch a case built on lies. But it didn't stop there. The documents Emma left behind exposed more than abandonment. They revealed years of fraud, false names, hidden accounts, unpaid debts that stretched across multiple states. Before long, investigators were circling him, and the same man who had walked into my daughter's funeral with polished shoes and a smug smile was now scrambling to defend himself against charges that could put him behind bars. I should have felt triumphant, but what I really felt was relief. Relief that Emma had been right, that her preparations had worked, that justice had finally caught up to the man who thought he could outrun responsibility forever. He hadn't just lost his inheritance, he had lost his reputation, his freedom, and the last shred of dignity he once carried. And yet, in the middle of his ruin, I couldn't help but think of Emma. Her real victory wasn't destroying him, it was building something that would outlast both of us. The foundation she set up for abandoned children was more than just a line in her will. It was her heart made permanent. Within months, scholarships were being awarded in her name. Counseling programs were launched for kids who had been left behind by parents who chose selfishness over love. Letters began arriving from families I'd never met, thanking Emma for giving their children a chance at healing and opportunity. Even after death, she was still giving, still noticing pain in others, just as she always had. I sometimes sit in her old bedroom, surrounded by her books and the posters she pinned to the walls, and I feel both the weight of loss and the light of pride. My daughter's name is spoken in hospitals, classrooms, and legislative halls where her ideas continue to ripple outward. She didn't just build a company, she built a legacy that protects the vulnerable and demands accountability from those who abandon them. And Robert, he gave her life. Yes, but he never gave her love. And in the end, that was the difference. Love built her into who she became. Love gave her strength to fight for others. And love is what keeps her alive in the people she continues to touch. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: betrayal does not have to define you. Sometimes the deepest wounds can become the source of the greatest strength. Emma turned her abandonment into armor, and I believe you can, too. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've faced betrayal and found your own way to rise above it, I invite you to share it. Your voice matters, and your story may be the light someone else needs. And if this touched you, please like, share, and subscribe, because the more we speak these truths, the more we remind each other that love always outlasts greed.